I'm Simon Cmrlec, the Chief Operating Officer of Vizsla Silver. We're a pure play silver company, silver developer, focused on developing our project in Sinaloa in Mexico. It's one of the greatest undeveloped silver projects that certainly I've seen in my career, and it's a really exciting few years we've got planned as we move forward into production.
Simon, good to meet you. Thanks for coming on the show. Stepping in for Michael. Glad of it. Right, we better introduce folks to you. So, who are you? Where have you been? What have you done? And how's that relevant to what you're doing today?
Yeah, hi, Matt. Thanks very much for having me on your show. I hope I can fill Michael's big shoes. It'll be tough. But a little bit about me, I guess, as you can tell from my accent, I'm not originally from Vancouver, Canada, but grew up in Australia. Decided to become a metallurgical engineer, for better or worse. Worked in operations for the first 5 years or so of my career, and then fell in love with construction. So I spent the next 10 years traveling around the world. That was the main attraction, actually, being able to travel around the world and build some of these fantastic projects for clients. Then I had a little bit of a pivot and I joined a company called Ausenco. Was at Ausenco for 15 years, finished there as the Chief Operating Officer at the end of 2023. And still a shareholder of Ausenco, a proud shareholder of that company. That was a great experience for me. Over my career with Ausenco, I think we developed more than 40 projects for our clients all over the world, and it let me see the good and the bad and the ugly of project development, but also a lot around the corporate world that juniors operate in, the challenges around financing projects and those sorts of things, which has been great experience for this role at Vizsla Silver. I guess in the context of Vizsla Silver, I started with Mike and Craig as the first independent director when we put together Vizsla Resources. Did that for 5 or so years, and then had the opportunity to come and join full time, which has been great.
Well, look, appreciate that kind of summary. Can I sort of also try and understand when you came in, what was the brief then, and what is it now?
The brief then was, it's pretty similar to what it is now. It's really, take this fantastic resource that we had at the time and move that forward through the various study phases, build the project, but probably more importantly, build out the team, build out the skill sets that we need to develop the project and to operate it successfully. But at the same time, maintain the momentum around the exploration. So it's a really interesting brief. It's not often that you get to join a single asset company and focus on those couple of dimensions and build the team out and build a project in pretty short order.
Okay, fine, right. Okay, so COO, you're managing a lot of people. I'm going to take you back to earlier days. You said you're a metallurgical engineer?
That's right.
Yeah. Okay. Here
Probably
we go.
The worst metallurgical engineer you've interviewed for a while, but
I'm going to see what you can remember. Okay, here we go. Sorry, I should take this more seriously. But look, in terms of the metallurgical variability testing structure and technical parameters, what are your team looking at? What's important with regards to this project?
What we've been looking at is we've really run a very staged metallurgical test work program. We're up to our 4th program now, we call it. It's a little bit of a misnomer because that 4th program's now been going on for 15 months. And initially, we really focused on selecting composites in line with the areas that we thought we would be mining first for some of the first test work. And we used that as side of test work to look at the shape of the flow sheet and to do trade-offs around, or do enough test work so we could do trade-offs around concentrate versus doré production and those sorts of things. In those first limited programs, you're always limited with the samples that you've got, and you're doing pretty high-level test work, so there's no element of optimization. It's more just really flow sheet development and selection. So following that, and in the subsequent programs, we actually just continued to put together more and more composites, and particularly as the resource expanded from initially first focused across Napoleon. You remember Napoleon was our first discovery. We put together a series of composites across Napoleon. In the parallel to that, we discovered Kapala, and we've just continued to fill out the composites that we've been testing around Napoleon and Kapala. Through those test work programs, we've also, just really focused on optimization. So once we got through the flow sheet part, and we were able to do a little bit of engineering work to convince ourselves that from an economic point of view, it made more sense to produce doré. We then evaluated flow sheets for producing doré. And then we moved into things like evaluating grind size and the effect of grind size and recovery, and certainly the variability in the recovery from the different parts of the deposit and how that interacted with the grind size. And now, if you look at where we are now, we're really into testing the tailings material and the rheology and making sure we can pump it, testing the settling of the leached material to make sure that we have the sizing of the CCDs and that sort of thing correct in the flow sheet. Testing the materials handling. This is a bit of a bugbear for me, but making sure that we can have the rock at the front end of the plant flow successfully through chutes and crushers, which has been the undoing of a lot of these sorts of projects, or at least caused a lot of pain in these sorts of projects. And really refining every element that we can of the flow sheet before we move forward into construction.
Right. Okay. So grind size, reagent consumption, and recovery. Cool. What about in terms of the amount of samples that you are working on at the moment, in terms of the spatial representation and also the kind of depth variation as well?
Yeah, so I think at the moment we're up to over 40 composites in this last test work program. In terms of spatial variation, once we discovered Kapala, we realised that this was going to be the first area that we'd mine. We did a lot of work there in the third test work program and even at the start of this one. Since then, we've been looking at other areas like La Luisa at depth, where we start to see more base metals and even Napoleon at depth. And, a bit more towards Kapala, towards the north. Kapala's great. Kapala is one of the best deposits ever. It's so wide. It's really consistent in the mineralogy. It's very high grade, and it's not easy to get Kapala. It's not hard to get Kapala right. Napoleon's a little bit more variable, and some of those structures around Napoleon. So that testing, like you said, at depth and to the extent of the deposits become more important for the latter years of the flow sheet.
Right. Okay. And because obviously this is all kind of part of that. I guess the sort of technical considerations with the kind of planned. How do you phrase it in the past? Incremental capacity ramp up, right? From 3,300 to 4,000 ton per day. The network's going to be important in terms of trying to understand the kind of limitations and the speed at which you can move.
Yeah, and this is where I'll deviate from being a true metallurgist, but network's great, but it's not the be all and end all.
Right.
You'll always have different performance in the process plant. So we've taken that network and we've tried to be ultra conservative with it. So if you look at the grind size that we've used, that 70 micron grind size, we are planning to grind really finely. In reality, we're seeing that it doesn't make a terrible difference in terms of recovery. So it's quite possible that when we start to mine, we don't need to grind that fine. But that gives us upside in terms of tons that we can process through the plant. And we've always tried to make those sorts of decisions. So take the met test work for what it's worth. The same with the flotation circuit that we bring in for Napoleon. It's on the fence whether that makes a whole lot of difference as well in terms of recovery, actually producing a flotation concentrate and then leaching it compared to just whole ore leach. But we got it in the flow sheet, we've sized it conservatively, we've submitted our permits on that basis, and now we have the optionality about when and where we use it, if you like. So we've always been trying to get as much information as we can, but then take a very conservative view of it, knowing that if things are better than what we think or things perform differently, we've probably got more risk to the upside than the downside.
Okay. It's kind of interesting, actually, as one of the kind of bigger pure play silver projects out there. I think people are excited about seeing what you can do in terms of moving this through to production. Maybe we need to kind of step back a little bit into kind of mining methodology and optimization, just so we can understand that flow through to that 4,000 ton per day. So can you maybe talk to how you and the team are approaching the management of dilution, ore loss, etc., in kind of long hole mining scenarios?
Well, I can talk about the approach we're taking with the engineering right now.
Okay.
We did the PEA, and I think the PEA was very robust, but it is a PEA. So the level of design that we could do in that wasn't what you'd see in a feasibility study or certainly into your final mine plan that you start to develop. But we did, we had everything modelled. It's a very robust design for what it is. But our main focus there was to prove to ourselves that we could mine at that sort of 3,300 tonne a day rate from one mine. I know that people do more than that, but, being ultimately a conservative engineer, in your first mine with a new crew, with new contractors and those sorts of things, we didn't really want to push it past that. And we wanted to make sure that we could design something that had a lot of flexibility to it. So big dimensions, that wasn't that selective, that could produce the tons and then still produce an economic outcome, which is what the PEA showed.
Right.
The same for Napoleon. Napoleon comes online in year 4 in the PEA. But the same sorts of considerations, that we're just using the same fleet, the same equipment, the same sort of dimensions, that we could make the production, first of all, and that was economic, knowing that we could come back then and review things like our mining dimensions, fleet selections, the way that we control the dilution and design for dilution in different parts of the ore body through the feasibility study. And that's what we've actually been doing for the last year. So it seems like there's been a pause between the PEA and the feasibility study, but in reality there hasn't. We've just continued to engineer, first of all, to support the permitting, but then also to optimise the mine, so that we could convince ourselves that we can actually still maintain that tonnage, but with some, more, so I hate the word selective mining, but certainly, more thought in how we're going to mine at each area of the deposits to reduce that dilution.
Well, I think that's a really important point you're making, because I think you've got to think about, what mining methods will be employed for specific veins or vein sections going forward. So in terms of trying to understand, drift and fill versus long hole methods, I mean, those conversations which are now being had, or have you already kind of decided and worked out how you're going to do that?
They've certainly been had over the last 6 months. And, what we're seeing at the moment is the mix between long hole and drift and fill is relatively consistent with what we thought in the PEA is probably some of the more optimal choices. There will be some changes for sure under the town of Kapala, which is the area that we had identified as drift and fill previously. There the vein's much more flat-lying. It lends itself much more to drift and fill, and also the fact that you're below the town and we want to minimise disturbance on the town makes a lot of sense. It's great that we're building this test mine now, because we're getting the opportunity to evaluate things like, the seismic effect of blasting as we're going down the ramp and that sort of stuff, which may help us optimise the crown pillars and some of that mining method in that area. And so all of that data is coming together really nicely in support of not just the feasibility study, but the real mine plan and mine design post the feasibility study.
That's a really a cool point, and most people don't really think of this, because that kind of blast design explosive selection criteria it's about optimizing fragmentation and minimizing dilution. But yeah, so can you explain why that's important to people?
Well, that's really important. Those two elements are really important when you get into the mining itself and you're looking at things like recovery and dilution and just even your progress rates during the day. But the other thing that's really important is the seismic response of the rock to that blasting, particularly when you think about that northern end of Kapala, where we've got some of our highest grades, our thickest widths, or our widest widths, the town sitting right above it. And, we've assumed at the moment a 50-metre crown pillar to protect that town. We think there's quite a potential to reduce that crown pillar, which has a huge effect on the amount of material amount of high-grade material that we can mine from that zone of Kapala. So actually mining while you're doing a feasibility study is really helpful, because we get real information about all of those parameters that we can use in the design. And, in parallel to the feasibility study, we're thinking about, okay, as soon as our permit is available, we want to continue to mine. What does our mine plan look like? Feasibility study mine plans, you can only take into account measured and indicated resources and convert that into a reserve. In reality, we're going to be mining through inferred resources as well and those sorts of things. So we're running these two exercises in parallel to look at the feasibility study mine plan and probably what's going to happen in the first couple of years of development of the mine, really understanding what that might look like in terms of grades and tons as we build the stockpile in front of the process plant.
It's kind of interesting. I think there's a really interesting phase that you're going through. And I think sometimes the market doesn't kind of reward these phases, but there's so much going on, which should be valued. So, for instance, let's talk about like rock mass classification, right? In terms of understanding the underground design and sort of how that kind of and how that classification affects your design parameters. So.
Yeah, you're probably getting into an area that's not really my area of expertise, and we've got other
Okay.
people that are much more skilled around that.
Yeah, but broadly, and you can also maybe encompass then some of the geotech monitoring that needs to go on, etc. I don't know if you want to go there. Yeah.
I do, and maybe just to talk about some of the geotech work we're doing, because that is all important as you're developing any underground mine. This year we did quite a bit of geotech feeding into the PEA. This year we're running a program that's around 20,000 metres of geotech drilling, and most of that's targeted towards oriented core through Kapala to start with, and certainly focusing on the first few years of mining, and then into Napoleon for the later parts of the mine plan to make sure that we've got the best information we possibly can to support stope dimensions and those sorts of things, particularly in those long hole sections, to look at the support we need, the backfill that we need in areas and that sort of stuff. So that information's coming together really nicely. Having a test mine's also great, because not only the information you can get through a drill hole is fantastic, but the information you can get actually tunneling through the rocks is even more valid. And even though we're only really at the start of the ramp, we're starting to get some confirmatory information around how the rock's behaving under those development conditions, under the blasting that we're doing, and how the ground support's performing through the top of the tunnel.
Right. So all of those kind of like ground control. Is it KPIs? Is that what they're called? Key performance indicators. That you're looking at those at the moment. But how does that optimize, or how does that help you optimize initial underground developments and any other of these sort of geological structured data points? I mean, how do you use all of that to kind of create more efficiencies further down the line? In terms of why collect it now, I guess is what I'm trying to get at.
Because ultimately in the PEA we were very conservative around all sorts of things, everything essentially. But in terms of the mine design, if you look at the amount of ground support that we had planned, some of the development rates and some of the stope dimensions, we took a very conservative view of the geotech based on the limited information that we had at the time. Improving that information now lets us actually be more specific in the designs for each area of the mine, potentially to reduce the amount of ground support that we need and some of those assumptions around it, but also, more importantly, confirm or improve stope dimensions in each area so that we improve our recoveries in areas. In some cases that will help us reduce dilution, and it will also help us with our production rates and our planning overall. So we think it's really important to have as much information as you can going into this, not just the information you need to support a feasibility study to have a QP sign off on it, but the actual information that you need for the detailed mine planning and the first few years of development, certainly. The reality is that in the first couple of years of the mine, you make or break it. If you don't hit your production, then we've seen the effect of that on a lot of other companies. But even more than that, if you make poor decisions and you end up sterilising some of this high-grade material that you typically target in the first couple of years, you can never recover that. And so what we're really trying to do is reduce the risk of those things happening, both the underperformance in terms of tonnage or in terms of production, but particularly the lifetime impact of sterilisation and those sorts of things.
Yeah. Okay. And here's one for you. I was reading about your decision to kind of go with like wet tailings management over, say, dry stack or paste. But why is that?
Ultimately, dry tailings, they certainly help you recover more water. In the 10 or 15% more of your water you can recycle with dry tailings. To use dry tailings successfully, you've really got to treat that as a geotechnical construction. So you've got to build a geotechnically stable heap as you progress forward. And that can be done quite successfully in a lot of places. My concern, and this is my concern backed by data and some of the histories and that sort of stuff, is that when you're in an environment like we are, where you have a lot of monsoonal rains for part of the year, maintaining the integrity of that heap becomes more difficult. Placing that material, maintaining the layers and maintaining the compaction between layers when you've got sort of torrential rainfall for half a day every day for 3 or 4 months, I see a lot of risk around that. I think we see a lot of risk around it, and our consultants do as well. In this area, everything we've seen is that the tailings are fairly benign. The area lends itself to very contained wet tailings dams that can be well and truly away from any of the major watercourses, towns, and those sorts of things. And the history's shown that the performance of well-constructed wet tailings dams is pretty good. Certainly poor constructed, uphill type constructed tailings dams, no, but with modern designs and good quality control and that sort of stuff, they can be fantastic. And so in our case, we've got great locations for that. We don't really need the additional water recycle. That we have more. We actually have, for a lot of the year, a positive water balance around the project to deal with, and we can mitigate the risk that comes from stacking those tailings in those wet environments.
Okay.
So that's what really led us to that decision. In terms of economics, it doesn't make a great deal of difference.
Right. What's the key one?
Yeah,
well, the key one on any kind of future, liability. Like, for instance, how what's the process you've gone through to kind of assess the potential, acid generation or neutral drainage conditions in the tailings or waste rock facilities?
Yeah, again, all of those composites that we've used and where we've produced tailings, we've done that testing on them, or we're in the progress of doing that. So that's one of them. That's key method. But even better than that is that there's so much old mining in this area. There are mines on our privately owned mines and processing facilities on our boundary that have been processing the same sorts of material. We actually have one ourselves that we've been rehabilitating our El Coco mill and tailings there, and none of those exhibit any signs of sort of high levels of acid drainage, heavy metals contamination or anything like that. All of the testing that we've done from water around the project to feed into the permit actually shows very, very good qualities, except for some elevated levels of organics around some of the towns, which is not a problem related to the mining and the tailings.
Okay, and any work. I mean, I don't know enough about Sinaloa to comment. Like seismic stability or liquefaction risks or any of that all been looked at?
It has, yeah. It's all incorporated as part of the design, and even more as we move forward. We're lucky in that it's not an overly onerous area in terms of seismic activity. It's not. We're not in Peru or Chile, thank goodness for that.
Right.
So when you look at that from a tailings dam point of view, that's not the major consideration.
Right.
Certainly the rainfall and the climate is one of the major design points for those sorts of earthwork structures.
Right. Okay. And I'm sort of looking at a few pictures. I think I know the answer to my next thought, which is around the kind of any logistical challenges with regards to moving heavy equipment or site access roads or power infrastructure, etc.
No, is the short answer. I mean, we're situated between two major highways. You can drive to I regularly drive from Mazatlan to site. I leave at 6 o'clock in the morning, and I'm out on site for the 6:45 pre-start meeting every morning. So the access is fantastic. In terms of power, we've got two high voltage power lines that run immediately across the project, and it's just turned out this way. It wasn't necessarily by design. We traded off a lot of locations and a lot of layouts for the project, but the location from an NPV point of view that we chose is situated almost directly below one of those HV power lines. We're in the process now of working with CFE to look at where they can tap into that line, and we can locate high voltage switch rooms. But in likelihood, the PEA I think allows for it within a 5 kilometre radius. I think it's probably likely to be in a 50 metre radius, so that's been fantastic. Yeah. And in terms of water, we have really good we're confident, even though we've permitted it and the PEA was based on us taking some water from the river for parts of the year. We're very confident with the work that we've done now that we'll be self-sufficient in terms of water, both from the capture of rainfall through parts of the year, but also the underground water that we have, or the dewatering of the mine is probably a better way to say it.
Yeah.
So great access to that as well. When I first went to this project in got to think when it was now 2018.
Yeah.
before we'd taken the option up on it, the first thing that jumped out at me, not being a geologist, and they were wildly excited about the rocks, was the infrastructure. And the thought that, hey, maybe we could make a discovery right here on a highway. Who's heard of that recently?
Yeah. So that whole kind of water management element is, you're not worried about climate variability or seasonal impacts, etc. It's or potential operational expansions. You're comfortable with the water side of things, by the sound of it.
Well, yeah, we are. I mean, we've got ongoing hydrogeology work around that.
Yeah.
We've been doing that for quite a long time. We're not seeing anything that gives us concern at the moment. There's a few things we're trying to understand, because we seem to have defined that the water table or the aquifer in that area is sort of 60, 70 metres below the Kapala portal that we're building. Yet we've got these perched pockets of water above that. So we're trying to understand some of that at the moment. And it's interesting. We found an old Kapala adit that's probably 100 years old. It's about 20 metres in elevation above our Kapala portal, and it's flooded. So we're trying to just reconcile some of those things at the moment. But it certainly doesn't look like there's climate variations or anything that would impact our ability to use that water.
I mean, you talked about the kind of plant location, layout, etc. There a second ago, but some of the other, with the power lines kind of coming through the property. Other things taken into consideration, just for the audience listening, things like haulage distances or actual energy consumption, and how you kind of optimize the materials handling. Explain to people how you look at those sorts of things.
Yeah, sure. And that was all part of the trade-offs around the layout. So if you look at the distance from the Kapala portal to the process plant, it is an uphill haul, but it's 400 metres long. So very short haulage distances. From the Napoleon portal, it's less than a kilometre hauling distance to the plant site. The Kapala ramp to get down to the top of where we're going to be mining for the first 2 years is 660 metres, 660 metres in length. It's less than 100 metres in elevation. So the project is very efficient in it and quite easy to lay out to minimise some of those sorts of things. In terms of the plant itself, I mean, we'll design, and we're using modern equipment and all those sorts of things. What we're really looking at is just how we can procure power in that area. And there are some opportunities to actually procure sort of sustainable energy from the grid. So we're evaluating some of those at the moment. One of the other interesting things, these projects are small, so the power requirement's pretty modest. We're sort of somewhere around 20 megawatts power requirement at full production with 2 mines running across the whole project. And if you put that in terms of kilowatts per ounce of silver, or ounce of silver equivalent produced, it's tiny.
Yeah.
Having all of this infrastructure around us, what it does let us do is, we'll build this high voltage power station. We'll also improve the power for the local communities. So we've got the 11 kV local distribution also runs right by that process plant site. We'll improve all of that as part of the project. We'll hopefully be able to, the same deals that we can do around the sustainable energy, extend that to the community power and that sorts of things as well. So, mining projects, I know everyone wants to talk about how mining projects are trying to save energy and become more efficient. In reality, most of them are, and particularly these small underground projects are, compared to other industries. And I think, the development of a project like this really lets us improve access to energy for those whole communities, which I think is probably the most important thing that we can do.
Yeah, no, I'm just thinking back to your experience at Ausenco. Ausenco's got a great reputation in the market. If you think of companies that are using Ausenco, you feel the degree of comfort around that. But when you're sort of stepping in here and talking about these kind of trade-offs and this kind of risk assessment yourself, and we've often had CEOs come on and talk about Monte Carlo simulations and fault tree analysis, etc. Are you kind of bringing a bit of Ausenco with you in terms of the way that you look at this and that risk assessment and trade-offs?
Yeah, well, having worked there for 15 years and leading the company for that period of time, it's a bit hard not to.
Yeah,
I mean, Ausenco has been supporting us on this project even before I started with early scoping studies and those sorts of things. They're leading the feasibility study. They led the PEA. And undoubtedly, that same thinking we used to define it at Ausenco. It's really, you need to focus on the return on investment from any mining asset. mining's such a cyclical industry, you don't have the luxury of not having that focus and that almost absolute focus on that metric, which then leads you to minimize haulage distances and think about the layout and the way that you do that, because it reduces operating costs. Or have a compact footprint around your process plant because you minimize the amount of earthworks that you have to do to start with, plus the concrete, steel, and all those things that contribute to 70% of the cost of building a process plant. Certainly all of those philosophies are well and truly baked into what we're doing, baked into our team and the Ausenco team. As you can imagine, there's a bit of Ausenco DNA here at Vizsla Silver now too, with me coming on board. I'm not the only one. So yeah, there's a lot of shared views around what it takes to develop a successful project, for sure.
Yeah. Okay. Well, like I say, it's very sort of comforting to hear that. Okay. With regards to, I guess the doing business in Mexico, right? You put out a release recently. You talk about an abundance of conservatism, or say caution. Strange phrase, just but what does it mean and why? Because the market kind of reacted to it. They weren't quite sure how to interpret that.
Yeah, and I've got to take all of the blame and the credit for that phrase. That was directly from me, and I've got a lot of similar feedback. But I think it does sum up what we've done here. Over the last 5 years, we've built great relationships with our local communities. We've run, I'm sure Michael's talked about this before with you, but the health fairs that we've run, the support that we've given for local businesses and all those sorts of things, that pays huge dividends, because it gives us a lot of intelligence about what they're seeing, and they talk to us a lot about what's happening in the area and that sort of thing. So what happened a couple of weeks ago is we were getting feedback from those local communities that they were seeing more activity. And it's no secret, the Sinaloa cartel is the one cartel in the area. Their leader, El Mayo, was captured by the Americans in September last year. Since then, there's been tension between two factions of the cartel, and that spilled over into a lot of violence, particularly up around Culiacan, Cosala, and places north of us. We were getting some information from our local communities that they were seeing more movements in line with some of that, cartel infighting, if you like, around the area. We're also seeing a lot more presence of the army and the military, and we were able to use our government contacts as well to sort of confirm what they were seeing. Based on the fact that we were seeing a lot more movements on the highway, we thought it made sense to pause. We're at the stage where it doesn't have an impact really in terms of our schedule or our budget. We're at a stage where we're still fundamentally, a late stage exploration company. So we don't have all of those hard controls in place that we will have in production, fences and guardhouses and those sorts of things that give it more security around the actual operating areas. And we've got, still out exploring on the sides of the highway and that. So we thought it made sense to take a pause. It's the first time that we've had to do it. The area for the last, certainly all the time we've been there, but reportedly, for the last 10 years or so has been really peaceful. And we don't expect this is going to last very long from what we're hearing and seeing too. We think that in the next week or so, next week, 2 weeks, we'll be back at it. So yeah, that's where the words abundance of caution came from. I'll come up with a different phrase next time, or hopefully there won't be a next time.
Okay, so everyone's fine. It's fine where you are, but you've taken an abundance of caution. Get it? Makes sense. Look, and look, if it's not interrupting business as well, I think that's the good news. Just looking at the last year's PEA numbers. I mean, was it June, July last year? Pretty impressive. July. It was July. Okay, some pretty impressive numbers coming through there. How do we move through the economic study phase? Because people will be assessed as a pure play silver developer. People are paying attention, especially off the back of the M&A that happened last year. Some pretty big numbers, which people got excited about. So how do you advance this project, and what sort of time frame would we expect to see? There's no shortcuts, right?
No, there's no shortcuts. And, to get a sense of what the feasibility study might look like, I think the best starting point is the resource update that we put out in January. That was a result of all of the infill drilling that we'd done. I think it was nearly 80,000 metres of drilling that we'd done since the previous resource update. And largely all of that targeted on just, improving the confidence around the resource infilling and improving the conversion. And we saw that, we set ourselves a target to have more than 200 million ounces from the mining areas, and importantly from the mining areas in measured and indicated, and more than 20 million ounces silver equivalent, we're talking here, in the measured category. We outshot both of those things. So we've ended up with nearly 40 million ounces in the measured category, 222 million ounces measured and indicated. And if you relate that back to the PEA, in the PEA, we assumed that we would produce about 170 million ounces over the life of the mine, that plus or minus. So if you take 200 million ounces, 220 million ounces, you say that, okay, you're probably going to convert 70 to 80% of them into a reserve. It gives you a sense that that infill drilling's been successful enough to support at least the economics in the feasibility in the PEA, and that's often a battle. As you know, companies are often scrambling around to find ounces to fill their mine plan between a PEA and a feasibility study. That hasn't been the case here, which has been great. The second thing is that we saw the grade improve. The grade across the property improved by nearly 5%. In Kapala, in the early years of mining, it was closer to 10%. So if you think, okay, they've got at least as many ounces, the grade, particularly in the first few years of mining, has increased by 10%. Through that infill program, it was amazing. Almost every hole that we drilled, particularly in Kapala, we hit the vein exactly where we thought we were going to, and we saw some better grades. It improved our confidence around the continuity of that structure and the width of it. And then if you think about the fact that we've also added about 50 million ounces to the total resource, so we went from 330 million to 320 million to 360 odd million ounces total resource. That can sort of paint a picture for what you might expect in the feasibility study. All of the work that we've been doing since putting out that resource has really been incorporating it into the mine plan and optimizing the mine plan like we were talking about before. And I think we're seeing some really good opportunities to reduce dilution. Ultimately, dilution reduces the amount of material you have to move, but also improves the grade that you're processing. And we're seeing the opportunity to do that. The more ounces that you produce per tonne of material, the more your cash costs and all-in sustaining costs reduce. So we're seeing some of that opportunity as well. So I think, for an investor looking at where we are now and what we might see in the back half of this year when we publish a feasibility study, I think everything's on track from all of the inputs that are going into that. We're seeing nothing negative, but a lot more positives. In terms of the development itself, we made the decision to permit from the PEA. We say permit from the PEA, but it was really the PEA plus about 4 months of detailed engineering around tailings dams and things like mine ventilation and that sort of stuff. But we submitted that MEA application. The statutory timeframe for approving that is 6 months. Mexico typically hasn't lived up to that, but we're seeing some really good support from at least processing that application from Seminat and from the federal government as well, which is quite heartening. We're constructing the test mine now, which is effectively the start of the mine. We're building the ramp at 5.5 metres by 5.5 metres. It's permanent infrastructure, and everything that's built there is very much permanent. So, from that to that end, we're in construction already. We're hopeful we're certain that as soon as permitting, the feasibility study engineering come together, that we will have the financing in place to develop the project. And that's a lot of the work that we're doing in the background now. And, we'll hit the go button. When those three things come together, we'll hit the go button and we'll be off. Our time to production from then is circa 16 to 18 months. I think, if the permits came in the first quarter of next year, we'll be finished in the back half of 2027 and producing. So that's how we're thinking of the development pathway. We've been talking about this now for almost 2 years, and we've hit all the milestones along the way. And I'm pretty confident that we'll continue to do that. Certainly, the unknowns of the permit and the financing. The financing is becoming much clearer, and there's a lot of interest in supporting the project from some of the usual banks and funds that operate in that space.
Yeah.
The permitting, we're having some great dialogue with the government, which is giving us a lot of heart around that as well. So That's how we're thinking about it, Matt. We're still targeting production back into 2027 and pretty confident we're going to get there.